The crack of it silenced the entire diner. Every fork froze. Every breath stopped. Jolene Whitfield stood behind the counter with her hand pressed flat against the chipped formica, and the sound of that slap echoed through her body, the way certain sounds do when they find the exact frequency of something already broken inside you. She had heard sounds like that before. The slam of a bottle against a kitchen wall at 2 a.m, the thud of a body hitting the hallway floor, the long, terrible silence that follows when someone you love has stopped fighting the thing that is killing them and you are standing 3 feet away with your hands at your sides because you have run out of ways to reach them. This sound was different in its specifics but identical in its architecture. Violence arriving in a space that was supposed to be safe. And Jolene, 53 years old, standing exactly where she always stood, doing exactly what she always did. Nothing. The old man in the corner booth did not make a sound. His coffee cup rattled once in its saucer, and his head snapped to the left with the force of the blow, and his reading glasses slid off the edge of the table and hit the floor with a small, precise click that Jolene would hear in her sleep for weeks. His cheek bloomed red immediately, the kind of red that arrives with its own heat, and he turned his head back slowly the way a man turns back to something he has already decided not to run from. And he looked up at the young man standing over him with eyes that had seen worse than this and survived it. Harold Prescott, 81 years old, Korean War veteran, widower. The man who had sat in that same booth every morning for 11 years and ordered the same thing every time and never once asked for anything he had not already earned. The young man standing over him was named Damon Ryker, though Jolene did not know that yet. She knew only what the diner knew. He was big. He was mean. He was the kind of man who walks into a room like the room owes him something and takes it personally when the room disagrees. He had come in 20 minutes earlier, banged through the glass door hard enough to make the little bell above it sound less like a welcome and more like a warning, and dropped onto a stool at the counter without looking at Jolene, without greeting her, without any of the small courtesies that lubricate the space between strangers in a public place. He had ordered coffee. He had scrolled through his phone. He had eaten eggs and toast with the joyless efficiency of a man fueling a body he intended to use as a weapon. And then the check had come and something in the numbers had offended him, and the thing that had been coiled inside him since before he walked through that door had found its excuse to unwind. $2.50. That was the distance between the morning Jolene had expected and the morning she was now standing inside. She had tried to explain. The prices had gone up. She had shown him the menu. She had kept her voice level and professional in the way she had learned to keep her voice level and professional through 10 years of marriage to a man whose moods could shift between sunshine and thunderstorm in the space of a single breath. Damon had not been interested in explanations. He had stood up from the stool, and standing, he was very tall, and he had raised his voice in the particular way that men raise their voices when they want everyone in a room to witness the performance of their anger. And he had called her things that she would not repeat and did not need to catalog, because they were not new. They were the same words more or less and the same tone more or less that she had been hearing from men who were angry about things that had nothing to do with her for most of her adult life. And then Harold had spoken. Sonny had said, just that word, not loud but carrying in the silence the way a stone carries when you drop it into still water. She told you what you owe. Pay what you owe and let the woman do her job. The words across the diner like something physical, and Damon had turned and something had happened in his face that Jolene recognized because she had seen it happen in Raymond's face and Ethan's face, in the faces of men who are deciding in real time whether the thing in front of them is worth destroying. Damon had decided Harold was worth destroying, or at least worth hurting. He had crossed the diner in 4 deliberate steps, and he had said things to Harold that Jolene could still hear ringing in the air of the room. You are a stupid old man sitting in a booth drinking bad coffee waiting to die. And Harold had not flinched. He had not moved. He had said 3 times with the same calm, the same voice, the same unshakable certainty, pay what you owe. And then the slap. And then the silence. And then Damon had picked up Harold's coffee cup with exaggerated politeness and set it back in front of him and said, Drink your coffee, old man, before it gets cold, and he had dropped a $5 bill on the counter without looking at Jolene and walked out through the glass door, and the bell had jingled twice and he was gone. Jolene stood behind the counter. Her hand was still pressed flat against the formica. Her other hand was pressed against her mouth. She was aware of every person in the diner the way you become aware of witnesses at the scene of something that should not have happened. The 2 truckers at the counter frozen over their pancakes. The young mother in the corner booth clutching her toddler like a shield. The older couple by the window, their shared newspaper lowered to the table, their faces wearing the identical expression of people who have just been reminded that the world contains things they would prefer it did not. Nobody had moved. Nobody had spoken. Nobody had stood between Damon Ryker and an 81-year-old man, and Jolene Whitfield had not stood between them either. She came around the counter. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, someone whose body was performing the expected motions while the actual person who lived inside it was somewhere far away, watching from a distance that felt both clinical and catastrophic. Mr. Prescott, she said, and her voice cracked on the second syllable, and she heard herself cracking and hated the sound of it. I am so sorry. I should have called the police. I should have done something. You did nothing wrong, Harold said. He was pressing the heel of his hand against his cheek. The skin was darkening, already moving from red towards something deeper. His eyes, when he looked up at her, were steady in a way that made the steadiness feel like it had been purchased at an enormous cost. You did nothing wrong, he said again. Come on now, do not let him have that. She pressed her lips together. She nodded. She went to the freezer behind the counter and retrieved the cloth ice pack she kept there, the one her mother Connie had always kept there, because Connie had understood that a diner on Route 9 would occasionally need to treat things that had nothing to do with cooking. She placed it on the table in front of Harold. Your eggs are probably cold, she said, trying to recover something that resembled normalcy. Let me get you a fresh plate. I am all right, he said. Mr. Prescott. I said I am all right. Not harsh, just certain. The certainty of a man who has calibrated exactly how much help he is willing to accept and has arrived at a number slightly below what is being offered. He picked up the ice pack and pressed it to his cheek. Go on, he said. You have got other customers. She stood there a moment longer, then she went. The diner came slowly back to life around her, not to its original warmth, not to the easy hum of a Tuesday morning running on schedule, but to something approximating function. The truckers ate. The couple picked up their newspaper. The young mother distracted the toddler with a set of keys. The machinery of ordinary life resumed its ordinary work, and the violence that had interrupted it was absorbed into the walls of the place the way Connie's diner had always absorbed things quietly, without complaint, without any particular expectation that things would be different tomorrow. Jolene wiped down the counter. She refilled the water glasses. She smiled at the truckers when they asked for more coffee, and she said, of course, and she poured it with hands that were steady enough, because steady hands were something she had learned a long time ago in a different kitchen during a different kind of crisis. And inside herself, in the place where she kept the things she did not show to customers or to the morning or to anyone, something was fracturing. Not breaking. Fracturing. The way glass fractures before it breaks the web of small cracks spreading outward from a single point of impact until the whole surface is compromised, even though it is technically still holding together. Because this was not the first time. This was not the first time Jolene Whitfield had stood in a room where a man was being hurt and done nothing. This was not the first time her hands had stayed at her sides while her heart screamed at them to move. This was not the first time the distance between what she felt and what she did had opened up beneath her like a crevasse, and she had stood at the edge of it and looked down and been unable to cross. Raymond. The name arrived in her mind the way Raymond himself used to arrive in rooms. Without warning, without preamble, filling all the available space with a presence that had once been warmth and eventually became weather. Raymond Whitfield. Her husband. 10 years dead. And still arriving in rooms she thought she had emptied of him. She leaned against the back counter where the customers could not see her face, and she closed her eyes for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds she was not in Connie's diner on Route 9. She was in the kitchen of the house on Birchwood Lane, and it was 3 a.m, and she was standing in her robe with her arms wrapped around herself. Because the cold was not the kind that comes from temperature, but the kind that comes from watching someone you love sit on the back porch in the dark at 3 a.m. with a bottle and a 1,000-yard stare, and the particular quality of silence that belongs to men who have gone somewhere terrible and cannot find their way back. Raymond had served in Iraq. 2 tours. He had come home the first time diminished in ways she could name and ways she could not. He had come home the second time as someone she was no longer entirely sure she recognized. The man she had married, the man who had laughed easily and danced with her in the kitchen and thrown their son Ethan into the air with the absolute confidence of a father who knows he will always catch what he throws. That man had gone to a place called Fallujah, and a different man had come back wearing his face. She had loved both men. That was the thing nobody told you about loving a veteran. You did not stop loving the person they had been. You simply began without anyone's permission and without any preparation, loving the person they had become, and the two loves existed inside you simultaneously, and they pulled in different directions and you held them both. Because what else were you going to do? You were married, you had children, you had a life that had been built on the assumption that the person you built it with would remain fundamentally the person you had started with. Raymond had not remained. Raymond had hollowed himself out over 7 years with bourbon and silence, and the particular savage discipline of a man who is managing a pain so large that management itself becomes the whole project of living. He had not been cruel. Jolene wanted that understood. She had told it to herself so many times it had become a kind of prayer. He was not cruel, he was not violent, he was not any of the words that would have made leaving simple. He was absent. That was the word. Present in body, absent in every way that mattered. Sitting at the dinner table but eating in some other country. Watching television but seeing something that was not on the screen. Holding her in bed but holding her the way a man holds something that reminds him of a place he can no longer get to, with tenderness so freighted with grief that the tenderness itself became a form of distance. And then the drinking got worse. And then the nights on the porch got longer. And then one morning, Jolene woke up, and Raymond was not on the porch, and was not in the bed, and was not in the kitchen, and the truck was gone, and the bottle was empty on the counter, and she had known in the way. You know, things, when you have been waiting for them so long, that their arrival feels less like surprise and more like the dropping of something you have been holding at arm's length for years. He had driven the truck into a tree on Route 14. The police said it could have been an accident. The road was dark, the curve was sharp, there was alcohol involved. They left the conclusion open, in the way that kindness sometimes leaves conclusions open, giving the family the space to believe whatever was most survivable. Jolene had chosen to believe it was an accident. She had chosen that the way you choose anything when the alternative is too large to look at directly, and she had carried that choice for 10 years like a stone in her pocket, smooth from handling, heavy from being handled. And she had never put it down, because putting it down meant looking at it. And looking at it meant asking the question, and asking the question meant admitting that she had seen it coming and had not stopped it. She opened her eyes. She was in the diner. The counter was solid under her hands. The coffee maker was cycling. Harold Prescott was sitting in his booth with an ice pack pressed to his face, and the morning was going on, and she was going on with it, because that was what Jolene Whitfield did. She went on, but the fractures were spreading. She thought about Ethan. 28 years old now, though the version of him that lived most vividly in her mind was still 21, standing in the kitchen of the Birchwood house 2 weeks after Raymond's funeral, with his face twisted into something she had never seen on it before, and his voice carrying the particular frequency of a young man who has decided to convert his grief into blame. Because blame, unlike grief, gives you someone to be angry at. You let him die, Ethan had said. You watched him fall apart for 7 years, and you just stood there. You just stood behind your counter and your smile and your everything is fine routine, and you let him die. She had not defended herself. That was the part that haunted her. She had not said any of the things she could have said, the things that were true, the things that would have at least complicated his certainty if not overturned it. She had not told him about the 3 times she had begged Raymond to see a counselor. She had not told him about the night she had sat on the floor outside the bathroom door listening to make sure the sounds coming from inside were just a man being sick and not a man being something worse. She had not told him about the VA appointments she had scheduled, that Raymond had not kept the pamphlets she had collected, that Raymond had not read the conversation she had attempted, that Raymond had ended by walking out of the room with the practiced efficiency of a man who has turned retreat into a form of communication. She had said nothing. She had stood in the kitchen and taken it the way she had taken everything, quietly, without complaint, without any particular expectation that things would be different tomorrow. And Ethan had left. He had packed a bag and put it in his truck and driven away, and she had stood at the window and watched the taillights shrink down Birchwood Lane until they turned onto Route 9, and disappeared. And she had not called out to him, had not run after him, had not done any of the things that mothers in movies do when their children leave, because Jolene Whitfield did not know how to chase people. She only knew how to wait for them. 7 years. 7 years of waiting. 7 years of the phone sitting on the counter of the diner like a small silent accusation. She had his number. She had kept it current through a mutual friend, a woman named Deborah, who had known both Jolene and Ethan, and who updated the number each time it changed without being asked and without asking why Jolene never used it. 7 years of picking up the phone and putting it down. 7 years of dialing the first 4 digits and stopping. 7 years of telling herself next week, next month, when I know what to say, when I have the words, when the time is right. The time was never right. That was the lesson Jolene had been learning her entire life. The time was never right for the things that mattered most. It had not been right when she should have confronted Raymond about the drinking. It had not been right when she should have told Ethan the truth about his father before Ethan built his own truth out of anger and absence. It had not been right when her mother, Connie, was dying, and Jolene should have asked the question she had always been afraid to ask. Connie. 3 years gone now. Cancer that arrived with the efficiency of something that had been waiting its turn and was not interested in negotiating. 4 months from diagnosis to funeral. Connie had run this diner for 37 years, had stood behind this counter through recessions and floods, and the slow economic dying of small-town Georgia had served coffee and eggs to every version of this community that had existed since 1981, and she had died in a hospital bed in November with Jolene holding her left hand and Bridget, Jolene's younger daughter, holding her right. Ethan had not been there. Jolene had not been able to reach him. The number Deborah had given her had been disconnected by then, and she had spent the last 12 hours of her mother's life alternating between grief for the woman who was leaving and grief for the son who was not there to say goodbye. Connie had said things in those final hours. Specific things. Things that Jolene turned over in her mind the way a person turns over a coin, examining both sides, looking for the meaning that the surface refuses to give up easily. Connie had said, "You hold too much, Jolene. You hold it all, and you do not ask anyone to carry any of it, and you think that makes you strong, but it does not. It makes you tired. And tired people make mistakes. Not because they are weak. Because they have forgotten that they were allowed to sit down." Jolene had not sat down. Not in the 3 years since Connie's death. Not in the 7 years since Ethan left. Not in the 10 years since Raymond died. She had stood behind this counter and served coffee and eggs and toast, and she had kept the diner running because the diner was the last thing Connie had touched. The last physical space that still held the shape of her mother's life, and letting it close would be a form of letting go that Jolene was not ready for. And so she stood, morning after morning, 6 days a week, opening the door at 6, closing it at 3, wiping the counter, refilling the coffee, patching the vinyl on the booth in the corner where Harold Prescott sat every morning because Harold was the closest thing to a constant that Jolene's life still contained. She had patched that booth 4 times in 3 years. Duct tape mostly once with electrical tape when the duct tape ran out and Harold had never mentioned it and she had never mentioned it, and the booth held together the way things hold together when someone decides they are going to hold together regardless of what the material conditions suggest. Harold was part of the diner the way the counter was part of the diner. He had been there when Connie was alive, had been Connie's favorite customer in the way that diner owners have favorite customers, the ones who require nothing and appreciate everything and whose presence turns a commercial space into something closer to a living room. After Connie died, Harold had simply kept coming, and Jolene had simply kept serving him, and neither of them had ever named what the other one meant to them, because naming it would have required acknowledging that both of them were lonely in ways that went beyond the word, and acknowledging that would have required doing something about it, and neither of them had the surplus energy for that particular reckoning. But she cared for him. She cared for him in the specific practical way that Jolene Whitfield cared for things. She remembered his order. She kept his booth clean. She noticed when his cough lasted longer than a week, and she mentioned it casually, not pushily, the way you mention things to people who do not want to be managed. She had his doctor's number written on a post-it note under the register next to Deborah's number, next to the number for this furnace repair company, next to all the other numbers that constituted the infrastructure of her carefully maintained life. And she had other numbers too. Numbers she had collected over the years with the quiet, purposeful care of a woman who understood that the men in her life were not good at staying connected to each other and that someone needed to build the bridges even if no one was currently willing to walk across them. She had Ethan's number, current as of 4 months ago, courtesy of Deborah. She had Bridget's number. Bridget was in Boston, 25 years old, working at a non-profit, calling on Sundays sometimes the way daughters call when they love their mothers but have built their own lives at a comfortable distance from the wreckage. And she had another number, a number that connected to a different kind of knowledge. 8 months ago, a man had walked into the diner on a Wednesday morning and sat at the counter and ordered black coffee, and when she had looked at him, she had felt something shift inside her chest because he had his father's eyes. Ethan. Ethan had walked into this diner 8 months ago and sat at this counter, and Jolene had looked at him across 7 years of silence, and her very first thought had not been words. It had been a physical sensation, a contraction, somewhere in the center of her body. The feeling of something that has been held at maximum tension for so long that the mere sight of the thing it has been straining toward is enough to make it tremble. He had not come back to reconcile. He had not come back to apologize. He had come back because he had heard through Deborah that Connie was gone, and he had wanted to see the diner one more time. And he had not expected Jolene to be standing behind the counter because he had assumed in the particular way that children assume things about their parents, when they have been away long enough that she would have sold it or closed it or moved on. She had not moved on. She was still there. And he had looked at her, and she had looked at him, and neither of them had said any of the things that 7 years of silence had built up between them. He had drunk his coffee. He had left $20 on the counter for a $3 cup. He had walked to the door, and at the door he had stopped, and without turning around he had said, "I am in Waycross. Have been for 2 years. If you need anything, Jolene. If the diner needs anything." He had not finished the sentence. He had taken a napkin from the dispenser by the door and written a phone number on it, and placed it on the nearest table and walked out. She had picked up the napkin, she had added the number to the post-it note under the register, and she had not called it. 8 months. She had the number for 8 months and she had not called because calling would mean speaking, and speaking would mean saying things she had not figured out how to say, and Jolene Whitfield did not say things she had not figured out how to say. She waited. She held. She stood behind the counter and she went on. Until this morning. She looked at Harold in his booth. The ice pack against his cheek. The cracked glasses on the table. The coffee gone cold in its cup. This old man who had spoken up for her when she could not speak up for herself, who had taken a blow that had been aimed at the space between them, who was sitting there carrying it, the way he carried everything silently, without complaint, without any expectation that the world would be kinder tomorrow than it had been today. And something in Jolene Whitfield, something that had been fracturing since the moment that slap connected, finally reached the point where fracture becomes decision. She reached under the register. She pulled out the post-it note. She looked at the number written in Ethan's handwriting, that same handwriting she remembered from the refrigerator drawings he used to make when he was 6. When the world was still a place where things you hung on a refrigerator stayed put. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this the way she noticed most things about herself. with a detached clinical awareness that did not translate into any change in behavior. Her hands were shaking and she was going to make the call anyway, because Harold Prescott was sitting in her mother's diner with a bruise forming on his face, and her mother had told her 3 years ago in a hospital bed, "You hold too much," and Jolene had finally found the thing she could not hold any longer. She picked up the phone. She dialed the number. The ringing sounded enormous in her ear, each ring a door opening onto a room she had not entered in 7 years. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. A voice she had not heard in 7 years except in dreams, and in the specific acoustic memory that mothers carry of their children's voices at every age, simultaneously the infant cry and the toddler babble and the 10-year-old laugh, and the 21-year-old rage all layered on top of each other like geological strata, each layer visible if you knew where to look. "Hello," said Ethan. Jolene pressed her free hand against the counter. She steadied herself. She opened her mouth. She had not figured out what to say. She had spent 7 years not figuring out what to say. She had spent her entire life not figuring out what to say. She said it anyway. "Ethan," she said, "it is your mother. There is trouble at the diner and I need you to come." The silence on the other end lasted 2 full seconds. 2 seconds that contained 7 years. Then Ethan said, "I am on my way." He did not ask what kind of trouble. He did not ask for details. He did not ask any of the questions that a person might reasonably ask when a phone call arrives from a voice they have not heard in 7 years, requesting their presence at a location they have been avoiding with the dedication of a man who understands that the place he is avoiding contains the person he is not ready to face. He simply said he was on his way, and the line went quiet, and Jolene stood in her mother's diner with the phone in her hand, and the morning pouring through the windows, and she thought, "I did it, I said it, I asked." She put the phone down. She looked at Harold. Harold was watching her. Obviously not in a way that announced itself. He was watching her the way he watched everything from the corner of his vision, with the practiced peripheral awareness of a man who had spent a winter on a ridgeline in Korea where looking directly at things could get you killed. She met his eyes. He gave her a small nod. Not a nod of understanding because he did not know what she had just done. A nod of recognition. The kind one person gives another when they can see that something has changed in the other person's posture, and they want to acknowledge the change without intruding on its privacy. Jolene went back to the coffee. She went back to the counter. She went back to the work of running a diner on a Tuesday morning that had already gone wrong in ways she could not have predicted, and was about to go further in directions she could not imagine. 23 minutes passed. She counted them without meaning to, the way a person counts things when they are waiting for something that will change the architecture of their day. She served the truckers their second round of coffee. She cleared the old couple's plates. She brought the young mother a refill on her orange juice and smiled at the toddler who was building something ambitious and unstable out of sugar packets. She checked on Harold twice. Both times he waved her off with the gentle, practiced dismissal of a man who has decided that his current condition does not warrant further attention and will not be persuaded otherwise. She wiped the counter. She wiped it again. She was wiping it a third time when she heard them. Not the jingle of the bell. The sound came before the bell. It came through the walls of the diner, the way weather comes through walls, not as a specific sound, but as a change in pressure, a shift in the atmospheric weight of the space, the specific vibration that a group of heavy motorcycles makes when they pull into a parking lot together, not racing, not revving, just arriving with the low, steady rumble of something that does not need to announce itself because its presence is announcement enough. Then the boots. On the steps outside. On the threshold. Heavy, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that a group of men make when they are moving together and have no reason to rush because the room will wait for them. The door opened. There were 6 of them. Big men, every one, not the inflated kind of big that comes from vanity and mirrors. The weathered kind. The kind that comes from years of road and work and the particular physical vocabulary of men who use their bodies for something other than display. Leather vests. Road dust. The unhurried confidence of people who occupy space without apology. And at the center of them, slightly ahead, the way the point of a formation is. And is slightly ahead a man with broad shoulders and dark hair going silver at the temples and a jaw that Jolene had last seen, set in exactly the same angle it was set in now, 7 years ago in her kitchen, when he had told her what he thought of her and walked out. Ethan. He had come. His eyes moved through the diner with the rapid, comprehensive scan of a man assessing a room, checking the exits, identifying the variables, and they found Harold's booth, and they found Harold's face, and they found the ice pack, and the cracked glasses, and the bruise, and then they found Jolene behind the counter. Mother and son looked at each other across the length of the diner and across 7 years of silence, and across all the things that had been said and all the things that had not been said, and across the space where Raymond's absence sat like a third person in every room either of them entered. Ethan's face did not soften. It did not collapse. It did something as more complicated than either of those things. It held the way a structure holds when it has been engineered to withstand exactly this much pressure and not a pound more, and it held. And Jolene watched it holding, and she understood that her son was here, and that being here was costing him something, and that he had come anyway. "Mom," he said. "Just that. Just the word. The way you say a word when the word is the whole sentence." Jolene's hands tightened on the counter. She did not cry. She did not move. She held herself together with the same discipline she had been using to hold things together for 20 years, and she said, "He is in the corner booth." The man who was hit. It was Harold. Ethan looked at Harold. Something moved through his face. Harold Prescott was not a stranger to Ethan. Harold had been eating breakfast in this diner since Ethan was 17. Harold had been part of the landscape of Ethan's adolescence, the way the cracked vinyl booth and the coffee maker and the bell above the door had been part of it. Permanent, reliable. Present every morning in a world where the other constants were systematically failing. "Who did it?" Ethan said. His voice was low and flat and carried the particular quality of a man who is asking a question not because he does not already know what he intends to do with the answer, but because the asking itself is a formality he has decided to observe. Jolene opened her mouth, but it was Harold who answered. From the booth with the ice pack still pressed to his cheek and his eyes steady and calm, and old Harold said, "He is gone, son. Went east on Route 9 20 minutes ago." Ethan looked at Harold for a long moment. Harold looked back. Something passed between them that Jolene could see but could not name, some current of recognition that flowed from the old man in the booth to the young man in the doorway and back again, carrying information that had nothing to do with the specific events of this morning and everything to do with the kind of men they both were. Then Ethan turned and walked back out through the door without a word, and the 5 men who had come in with him turned with him in the same motion, like a single organism redirecting its attention, and the boots hit the linoleum, and the door swung shut, and the bell jingled twice, and the sound of the motorcycle starting up came through the walls like distant thunder rolling east toward Route 9. Jolene stood behind the counter. Her hand was pressed to her chest. She could feel her own heartbeat under her palm, fast and hard and real. She looked at Harold. Harold looked at her. "You called him," Harold said. "Yes," Jolene said. The word came out steady. It came out like a word that had been waiting 7 years for permission to exist and had finally received it. Harold nodded once. That same small nod. And something in his face, something behind the bruise and the ice pack, and the 81 years shifted into an expression that Jolene recognized because her mother used to wear it. It was the expression of a person who is witnessing someone do a brave thing and wants them to know it has been seen. Jolene Whitfield stood in her mother's diner and waited for her son to come back. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, the waiting did not feel like the thing she was doing instead of living. It felt like the beginning of something she had been afraid to start. Harold sat in his booth with the ice pack pressed to his cheek and his cracked glasses on the table, and the coffee Jolene had brought him going cold for the second time that morning, and he thought about things he rarely allowed himself to think about in the company of other people. He thought about Margaret, his wife. 6 years gone. The woman who had loved him for 51 years, with a patience that he had never earned and never stopped being grateful for, and never once told her he was grateful for, because telling her would have required explaining what she had been patient with, and explaining that would have required opening the door to Korea. And Harold Prescott had spent 4 decades making sure that door stayed shut. Margaret had known anyway. That was the thing about Margaret. She had known without being told, the way certain people know things, not through information, but through attention, through the accumulated evidence of 30 years of watching a man sit in a truck in a driveway for 20 minutes before coming inside. Of hearing the nightmares through the bedroom wall, of feeling the distance between the man sitting at her table and the place where that man actually lived. She had not complained. She had not demanded. She had simply been there morning after morning, year after year, with the coffee and the eggs and the quiet, luminous presence of a woman who had decided that loving a man who could not fully arrive was better than not loving him at all. He thought about Lester, Corporal Lester Gibbs, a man he had served with on a ridgeline in Korea in the winter of 1950 when the temperature dropped to numbers that the human body was not designed to process, and the Chinese forces came out of the dark in waves, and the world reduced itself to the simplest possible equation. Stay alive. Keep the man next to you alive. Everything else is philosophy. Lester had been the man next to him. Lester, who had a laugh like a screen door banging in the wind and who argued about baseball with the kind of passion that most people reserve for religion. Lester, who had taken a piece of shrapnel to the right ear during a firefight and had kept fighting with blood running down his neck and a grin on his face that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with the specific madness that combat produces in men who refuse to stop. Harold had asked him once in the middle of that firefight with bullets tearing up the frozen ground around them, how do you do that? How do you just sit there while everything is going sideways? And Lester had said, because sideways is still a direction, you can still move. Harold had carried that sentence for 70 years. He had carried it the way he carried everything, silently close to the chest in the specific private language of men who had been to places they could not describe and had seen things they could not unsee, and had come home to a country that thanked them when it remembered and forgot them when it was convenient and expected them to be normal, when normal was a place they could no longer find on any map. He thought about the man who had just hit him. The young man with the tattoos and the leather jacket and the manufactured swagger. He thought about the look in that man's eyes in the moment before the slap, the calculation, the decision, the specific coldness that is not really coldness at all, but it is the surface of something much hotter and much deeper and much more dangerous. He had seen that look before. He had seen it in Korea. He had seen it in the mirror. He pressed the ice pack a little harder against his cheek, and he thought about the fact that he was 81 years old and sitting in a diner in Georgia with a bruise on his face and cracked glasses on the table, and that the woman behind the counter had just done something extraordinary, something that he could feel the significance of, even though he did not yet know the details of it, and that the morning was not over, and that the thing about mornings was that they did not ask your permission before they changed the shape of your day. He thought about Jolene. He thought about the way she stood behind that counter every morning like a woman standing guard over something she could not bear to lose. He thought about the way she patched his booth and refilled his coffee, and asked about his cough, with the careful casualness of a person who cares deeply, but has learned that caring deeply is best expressed in small practical gestures rather than large emotional declarations. He thought about the numbers she kept under the register. He knew about the numbers. He had seen her write them down, he had seen her add new ones and cross out old ones, and he had never asked, because Harold Prescott did not ask questions he was not prepared to hear the answers to. But he knew. He knew in the way that old men who have spent a lifetime watching people from the corners of their eyes know things. He knew that Jolene was holding something together and that the something was larger than a diner and more complicated than a business, and that the holding was costing her something that showed around her eyes and in the set of her shoulders and in the way she sometimes stood at the back counter when she thought no one was looking and closed her eyes for 3 seconds as if she were visiting a place she could only get to with her eyes shut. He knew. And he had not said anything because saying something would have been the kind of involvement that Harold had spent 81 years avoiding, and avoiding involvement was the architecture of his survival. And dismantling the architecture of your survival when you are 81 years old is not something you do lightly. But this morning the architecture had been hit. Literally. A man's hand across his face in a public place, and the sound of it had traveled through the walls of his carefully constructed isolation and had cracked something that he had believed was solid. And now Jolene had picked up the phone and called someone, and Harold did not know who, but he knew, from the look on her face when she put the phone down, that whoever it was mattered in the specific way that only people who have the power to break you matter. He picked up his coffee. It was cold again. He drank it anyway because the gesture mattered more than the temperature. The morning of November 14th had started no differently than any other morning for Harold. He had pushed through the glass door at 7:03, the little bell jingling the way it always did, and Jolene had looked up from behind the counter and given him the smile she always gave him warm. A little tired around the edges, but real. "Morning, Mr. Prescott," she had said, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Usual, you know it," he had said, and he had settled into his booth. The diner had been doing its regular morning business. The 2 truckers at the counter working through plates of pancakes with the focused devotion of men who had not eaten since yesterday. The young mother in the corner booth trying to keep a toddler from dismantling the sugar caddy. The older couple by the window sharing a newspaper in companionable silence the way only people who have spent 50 years together can share a newspaper without a single word and without a single moment of awkwardness. Harold had watched them without watching. It was a skill he had developed in Korea and had never lost. Taking in the room without letting the room know you were doing it. He had wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. The joints were not what they used to be, and cold mornings made them stiffen, and he had let himself just breathe. It had been one of the few truly peaceful acts left to him. Just breathing, just being in a warm place with coffee and the low sounds of ordinary human life going on around him. He had maybe 7 minutes of that peace. Then the door had banged open. And everything that followed had followed with the particular momentum of things that cannot be stopped once they start. The young man, the anger, the counter, the insults, Harold's voice crossing the room like a thrown stone. "Pay what you owe." The words he had said 3 times, because saying them once had not been enough. And because Harold had learned in Korea that when you say a thing, you believe you say it, until the person across from you understands that you are not going to stop saying it. And then the slap. And now he was sitting in his booth with an ice pack and a bruise, and the wreckage of a morning that had been peaceful 7 minutes ago, and somewhere on Route 9 a young man was driving away from something he had done, and somewhere in a parking lot outside this diner, a group of motorcycles had just started their engines, and Jolene Whitfield was standing behind her mother's counter looking like a woman who had just crossed a line she had been standing behind her entire life. Harold understood crossing lines. He understood it the way you understand anything you have spent a lifetime studying from the wrong side. He had stood behind more lines than he could count. The line between silence and speech. The line between presence and absence. The line between the man Margaret deserved and the man he had been able to be. He had stood behind all of them, and he had watched other people cross them, and he had told himself that standing behind a line was a form of discipline, a form of strength, a form of the particular military stoicism that had gotten him through Korea alive, and had gotten him through everything after Korea in a state that looked enough like living that most people did not question it. But Jolene had just crossed a line. He had seen it happen. He had watched her face change the way a face changes when the person behind it makes a decision that they cannot unmake, and he had seen the fear in it and the resolve in it, and the particular trembling courage of a person who is doing something for the first time that they should have done a long time ago. And something in Harold, something that had been sitting in that booth for 11 years, drinking coffee and watching the world from a safe distance, shifted. He was not sure what it shifted into. He was 81 years old. He did not expect revelations. He expected mornings and coffee, and the slow, reliable diminishment of a body that had served him well and was now serving him less well, and the eventual quiet ending that he had been walking toward with the patient resignation of a man who had already survived more than he had expected to survive. But the morning was not done with him. And Harold Prescott, who had never asked for anything he had already earned, who had carried a Purple Heart in a shoebox in his closet wrapped in a piece of cloth that Margaret had cut from her apron, who had sat in this booth for 4,000 mornings and asked nothing of anyone, was about to receive things he had not asked for. Whether he was ready for them was a question the morning did not intend to ask. Said to 12 minutes passed before the motorcycles came back. Jolene heard them before she saw them, the way you hear weather returning, the low roll of engines coming from the east on Route 9 decelerating, turning into the lot, settling into silence one by one like large animals lying down. She had spent those 12 minutes the way she spent most difficult stretches of time. Working, refilling coffees, clearing plates, smiling at the truckers who were trying very hard to pretend that nothing unusual had happened in this diner this morning, that 81-year-old men got slapped in public establishments every day and groups of bikers arrived to handle it. And all of this was perfectly normal and required no comment or adjustment to anyone's breakfast plans. Harold had not moved from his booth. He had switched the ice pack from his left cheek to the table and was sitting with both hands around his coffee mug, staring at something that was not in the diner, something that lived behind his eyes in the specific country that old soldiers carry inside them, the country that is always winter and always dark and always just beneath the surface of whatever room they happen to be sitting in. Jolene knew that country. She had watched Raymond visit it every night for 7 years. She had never been allowed inside. It had never been given a map or a key or even a description of the terrain. She had simply been told by the silence and by the distance and by the 1,000-yard stare that turned her husband into a stranger at 3 a.m. that the country existed and that she was not welcome there. The door opened. Ethan came in first, alone. The 5 men stayed outside, and Jolene could see them through the window leaning against their bikes with the patient, unhurried posture of men who understood that whatever was happening inside did not require their presence and would take exactly as long as it needed to take. Ethan's hands were clean. His knuckles were unmarked. His face was controlled in the way that faces are controlled when the person behind them has made a deliberate decision about which emotions to display and which to hold in reserve. He had not hit anyone. Jolene could read that much. Whatever had happened on Route 9 had happened with words, not fists, and the fact that words had been sufficient told her something about her son that she filed away for later examination. He walked to Harold's booth. He stood at the edge of it the way a man stands at the edge of something when he is not sure how much of his weight it will support. "He will not come back," Ethan said. Harold looked up at him. The old man's eyes moved over Ethan's face, his hands, the set of his shoulders reading him the way Jolene imagined he had once read landscapes in Korea, checking for threats, for ambiguities, for the things that were not immediately visible but were present nonetheless. "Sit down," Harold said. Ethan sat. He sat across from Harold on the bench that faced the window, and he put his hands on the table the way people put their hands on tables when they need to feel something solid. And he looked at Harold's bruised cheek and his cracked glasses and the ice pack sitting between them like evidence. "Are you all right?" Ethan said. It was not really a question. It was the thing you say when the real question is too large to ask and you need a smaller one to start with. "I have been hit harder," Harold said, "by people who meant it more." Ethan almost smiled. It was a complicated almost smile, the kind that holds too many things at once and does not fully commit to any of them. He glanced toward the counter toward Jolene, and the almost smile disappeared and something else took its place. Something less composed and less defended and more like the face of a boy who has come home after a long time away and is not sure if the door is still open. Jolene came out from behind the counter. She carried 2 mugs of coffee, because carrying things gave her hands a purpose, and a purpose gave her hands a reason not to shake. She set one in front of Ethan without asking if he wanted it. She set the other in front of Harold to replace the one that had gone cold. She did not sit down. She stood at the edge of the booth the way she had stood at the edges of things her entire life, present but not quite participating, close enough to be useful, but not close enough to be part of whatever was happening. "Sit down, Mom," Ethan said. The word hit her in the center of her chest. Mom. He had not called her that in 7 years. He had called her Jolene when he left. He had called her by her first name the way you call someone by their first name when you have decided they are no longer the thing the other name signifies. She sat. She slid into the booth next to Harold, because that was the side that was available, and because sitting next to Harold felt safer than sitting next to Ethan. Safer in the specific way that proximity to a person you have not hurt is safer than proximity to a person you are terrified of hurting further. The three of them sat in that booth. Harold with his bruise, Jolene with her coffee, Ethan with his hands flat on the table and 7 years of distance radiating off him like heat from asphalt. Nobody spoke for a long time. The diner filled the silence the way diners do, with the clink of silverware and the low murmur of other people's conversations and the coffee maker doing its patient mechanical work behind the counter. The sounds were familiar to Jolene. They were the sounds she had arranged her life around. The sounds that told her the world was still turning even when her own part of it had stopped. "You look tired," Ethan said. He said it to Jolene, and he said it without the edge she had expected, without the sharpness that had characterized every word he had spoken to her in that kitchen 7 years ago. He said it the way you say something you have noticed and cannot unnotice and have decided to be honest about. "I am tired," Jolene said, and the honesty of it surprised her. She had not said that to anyone. Not to Bridget on Sunday calls, not to Harold who would have listened, not to herself in the mirror in the mornings before opening, when the face looking back at her was Connie's face with Jolene's eyes, and the gray that was coming in at the temples like a slow announcement of something she was not ready to receive. "I have been tired for a long time," she said. Ethan looked at her. The thing in his face was working the thing that was not quite anger and not quite grief and not quite the thing it had been 7 years ago. It was something in transition. Something that had started as one thing and was becoming another thing and had not yet arrived at whatever it was going to be. "I know," he said. Harold was watching them both. He was watching them with the particular attention of a man who has spent a lifetime observing the space between people, the distance and the silences and the things that live in the gaps where conversation should be. He picked up his coffee. He drank it, he set it down, and then he said something that neither of them expected. "Your mother," Harold said to Ethan, "stood behind that counter this morning and watched a man walk into her diner and insult her and threaten her, and she kept her composure the whole time. She did not raise her voice, she did not lose herself, she stood there and she took it and she did her job." Ethan looked at Harold. Harold looked back at him with those steady old eyes. "And then when that man hit me," Harold continued, "your mother was the first person to move. She came around that counter and she brought me ice and she apologized for something that was not her fault, and she took care of the situation the way she takes care of everything in this diner. Quietly. Completely. Without asking for credit." Jolene felt heat rise in her face. "Mr. Prescott," she started. "I am not finished," Harold said. Not unkindly, just certain. The way he said everything. He looked at Ethan. "And then she picked up the phone and she called you. And that, son, was the bravest thing I have seen anyone do in this diner in 11 years of sitting in this booth. Because calling someone you love after a long silence is harder than anything that man did to my face this morning. That takes a different kind of courage." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Jolene looked at the table. She looked at her hands on the table, the hands that had wiped this counter 10,000 times the hands that had patched vinyl and poured coffee, and held Raymond's hand in the dark and let go of Ethan's when she should have held on. Ethan was very still. He was looking at Harold with an expression that Jolene could not fully read, but that she recognized in its outlines, because she had seen something similar on Raymond's face in the early days before Iraq, when Raymond would encounter something unexpectedly kind and would not know what to do with it, because kindness for men who are built the way Raymond was built is harder to absorb than cruelty. Then Ethan turned to Jolene. He turned to her the way a person turns towards something they have been facing away from for a long time deliberately, with the full weight of the turning, knowing that what they are about to see will change the thing they have been telling themselves. "I have been in Georgia for 2 years, Ethan said. Jolene went still. "I moved to Waycross 2 years ago." He paused. "I gave you my number 8 months ago." He paused again. "Before that, I used to drive past the diner sometimes. Early. Before you opened. Just to see if the lights were on." Jolene's throat closed. She could feel it closing, the physical constriction of a body responding to information that is too large to process through normal channels. 2 years. Her son had been 80 miles away for 2 years. Every morning she had driven to this diner and opened the door and turned on the lights and started the coffee. Ethan had been in Georgia. Every Sunday when Bridget called from Boston, Ethan had been in Georgia. Every time she had stood behind this counter and felt the weight of his absence pressing down on her like weather that would not lift, he had been close enough to drive 2 in an hour and a half. "Why?" she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. "Why did you not come in?" Ethan looked at the table. He looked at his hands on the table. Hands that were larger than she remembered, scarred in places she did not recognize, carrying the evidence of a life she knew nothing about. "Because I did not know how," he said. I did not know how to walk through that door and sit at that counter and look at you and say the things that needed to be said. I kept thinking I would figure it out. I kept thinking next week, next month, when I have the words. He looked up at her. I never had the words, Mom. I still do not have the words. I just have the fact that I am sitting here and that is going to have to be enough for right now. Jolene pressed her hand to her mouth. She pressed it there hard the way you press a hand against something you are trying to keep from opening. She held it there for 3 seconds. Then she lowered it. It is enough, she said. Harold was looking out the window. He was giving them the privacy of his averted gaze, the kindness of a man who understands when a moment belongs to other people and chooses to be present without intruding. But Jolene saw the corner of his mouth move slightly, and she knew he was hearing everything, and she knew that hearing it was doing something to him that had to do with his own silences, his own distance, his own years of sitting in this booth alone. There was a thing Jolene needed to say. She had been carrying it for 10 years. She'd been carrying it the way Harold carried Korea, quietly, close to the chest, wrapped in the certainty that speaking it would hurt more than holding it. But she had just watched an 81-year-old man get slapped in the face for speaking up. And she had just made a phone call she had been afraid to make for 7 years, and she was running out of reasons to be silent. Ethan, she said, what you said to me in the kitchen. About your father, about me letting him die. Something moved through Ethan's face. A flinch. Fast controlled but visible. I need to tell you what happened, Jolene said. What actually happened. Not the version you built when you were 21 and grieving and needed someone to blame. The real version. Ethan looked at her. His eyes were dark and steady in a way that reminded her of Raymond before Iraq. Back when Raymond's steadiness was a thing you could rest against rather than a wall you could not get through. I tried to save him, Jolene said. Her voice was even. She had practiced this evenness for 10 years without knowing she was practicing it. 3 times I got him to agree to see someone at the VA. 3 times he canceled. I hid the bottles. He found new ones. I sat outside the bathroom door at 2 in the morning listening to make sure he was still breathing. I read every pamphlet the VA sent. I called every hotline they listed. I did everything I could think of, and none of it was enough, because you cannot save a person who has decided that being saved requires them to look at the thing that is killing them and they are not ready to look at it. She stopped. She steadied. She continued. Your father was not weak. I want you to hear me say that. Raymond was not weak. He was carrying something that was too heavy for one person, and he did not know how to put it down, and he did not know how to ask anyone to help him hold it. And I loved him through all of it. Every version of him. The one who danced in the kitchen, and the one who sat on the porch at 3 in the morning, and the one who drove his truck into a tree on Route 14. Her voice did not break. She did not allow it to break. But the cost of not breaking was visible in her face and the tightness around her eyes and the way her hands gripped the edge of the table. I did not let him die, Ethan. I watched him die. Those are different things, and watching someone you love die slowly is the hardest thing I have ever done. And I have been carrying the weight of it for 10 years, and I am tired of carrying it alone. The diner was very quiet. The truckers had gone. The young mother was paying her check at the register, moving with the specific urgency of a woman who can feel that the room she is in has become too private for her presence. The older couple by the window were finishing their coffee, with the deliberate slowness of people who are not leaving but are making themselves very small. Ethan sat across from her. His jaw was working. His hands on the table had curled into fists, not the fists of anger. The fists of a man holding something and keeping it contained, managing the pressure of information that is rearranging the furniture of everything he has believed for 7 years. Harold spoke. He spoke quietly the way he spoke everything, but in the silence his voice carried the way a voice carries across water. I know something about what your mother is describing, Harold said. He was not looking at Ethan. He was looking at his coffee cup, at his own hands wrapped around it, at the landscape of age and weather and time that those hands represented. I came back from Korea in 1953, and I put on the flannel and the boots, and I went back to being a regular man. But a part of me stayed over there. And I spent 40 years trying not to let anyone see that the space where that part used to be was empty. He looked up at Ethan. My wife Margaret saw it. She saw it from the beginning. She loved me through it the way your mother loved your father through it. And I let her carry the weight of my silence for 51 years, because I was afraid that if I opened my mouth and let the truth out, the people I loved would know I was broken. And I believed being known as broken was worse than being broken alone. He paused. It was not worse. It was just lonelier. Ethan was staring at Harold. Something was happening behind his eyes. The kind of recalculation that takes place when a fundamental assumption gets pulled out from under a person and the structure it was supporting has to find a new foundation or collapse. My father, Ethan said slowly, used to sit in his truck for 20 minutes before coming inside after work. Every day. Just sitting there. I could see him from my bedroom window. He would just sit there with his hands on the steering wheel staring at the house like he was deciding whether to come in. Harold nodded slowly. I did the same thing, he said. Not the truck, but the same thing. You sit outside the life you're supposed to be living, and you look at it and you know it is yours. And you know the people inside it love you, and you cannot make your body cross the distance between where you are and where they are, because the distance is not physical. It is the distance between who you were before and who you came back as, and no amount of walking will close it. Ethan turned to Jolene. His eyes were wet. He was not crying. He was in the territory just before crying, the territory where the body has decided what it wants to do and the will is still holding it back. I thought you did not try, Ethan said. That is what I told myself. I told myself that you saw it happening and you just accepted it because accepting was easier than fighting. He stopped. His jaw tightened. I was wrong. Yes, Jolene said, you were wrong. She said it without anger. She said it the way you say a thing that has been true for so long that the truth of it has become simply a feature of the landscape rather than a wound in it. And I should have told you, she said. I should have told you everything I just told you when you were 21 and standing in my kitchen and blaming me. I should have opened my mouth and said the words and made you understand. But I did not, because I was so tired of fighting for people who could not hear me that when you stood there and told me I had failed, some part of me believed you. Ethan made a sound. A low, involuntary sound, the kind a person makes when something hits them in the center of themselves. He reached across the table. His hand was open. He put it palm up on the table in front of Jolene the way a person offers something they are not sure will be taken. Jolene looked at his hand. She looked at it the way she had looked at the phone number on the napkin 8 months ago, with the specific calculation of a woman who has been hurt enough times by reaching out that reaching out itself has become an act of courage. She put her hand in his. Ethan's fingers closed around hers. Not gently, not delicately. The way you hold something you have been afraid of losing. The way Raymond used to hold her hand before Iraq. When holding was still simple, when touch was still a language, they both spoke fluently. I am sorry, Mom, Ethan said. His voice was rough in the way that words get rough when they have been held back for too long. For what I said. For leaving. For the 7 years. For all of it. Jolene held his hand. She held it and she felt something shift inside her that she had not felt shift in 10 years. Not a breaking. A releasing. The slow tectonic movement of a weight being transferred from one person to two people. The specific relief of not carrying something alone anymore. Then the door banged open. Not the quiet jingle of a regular customer. Not the controlled entrance of Ethan and his men 20 minutes ago. This was a bang. The same bang that had started the morning. The same frequency of door meeting frame that belongs to a person who is making a point. Damon Ryker was standing in the doorway. Jolene's body reacted before her mind caught up. Her hand tightened around Ethan's. Her spine straightened. Her breath caught and held the way breath catches when the body recognizes a threat it has encountered before and does not intend to encounter the same way twice. Ethan was on his feet in the same heartbeat. His hand left Jolene's and his body shifted into the space between the door and the booth with the fluid, unhurried precision of a man whose body knows how to occupy the exact piece of ground that matters. Through the window, the 5 men outside had registered the sound. Jolene could see them straightening, moving away from their bikes, orienting toward the door. Not running, just ready. The way weather is ready before it arrives. But Jolene was already moving. She was around the counter before she understood that she had decided to be around the counter. She was in the open space of the diner before she understood that her legs had carried her there. She was standing in front of Ethan between her son and the man in the doorway before she understood that for the first time in her entire life she was not standing at the edge of something. She was standing in the middle of it. Ethan, she said, sit down. Mom, he started. Sit down. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The voice she used was the voice she had not known she possessed. Until this moment, the voice of a woman who has spent 53 years holding things together quietly and has discovered that quiet is not the same as silent, and that holding things together gives you a strength you did not know you were building until the moment you need to use it. Ethan looked at her. He looked at her the way you look at a person who has just done something you did not think they were capable of. Then he sat down. Jolene turned to Damon. He was standing just inside the door, shoulders up, jaw set, fists half closed at his sides. He was not the same man who had swaggered in 3 hours ago. The swagger was gone. What remained was tighter, more compressed, more honest. The posture of a person who has been stripped of their performance and is standing in whatever is underneath it. She walked toward him. She walked the way Harold had spoken that morning, not loudly, but in a way that carried in a way that filled the space between them with something that was not aggression and was not submission, but was simply presence. The presence of a woman who was finished standing at the edge. She stopped 3 feet from him. She looked up at him because he was taller than her by a significant margin. She looked at his face. She looked at the tattoos and the bulk and the leather jacket. And she looked past all of it, the way a woman who has lived with a man carrying invisible wounds learns to look past the surface presentation to the thing underneath. You came back, she said. Damon stared at her. He had not expected her. He had expected the old man or the bikers or the son who had found him on Route 9 and spoken to him in a voice that still echoed. He had not expected the woman behind the counter, the one he had yelled at, the one whose establishment he had disrupted, and whose morning he had ruined and whose customer he had struck. "I have been standing behind that counter for 20 years, Jolene said. I have served coffee to men who were carrying things they could not name. I was married to one. I raised a son who became one." She paused. "I know what it looks like when someone walks into a room looking for a place to put something down that is too heavy to keep carrying." Damon's jaw tightened. Not the tightening of arrogance. The tightening of a man fighting something he is not sure he can control. "You did not come back to start more trouble," Jolene said. "If you wanted trouble, you would not have come back alone. You came back because something is not finished in you and you do not know what to do with it." The diner was completely still. Harold sat in his booth watching Jolene with an expression she had never seen him direct at anyone. Ethan sat across from Harold watching his mother with an expression that was close to the one Harold was wearing. The 5 bikers outside had settled back against their bikes, reading the room through the windows, understanding that whatever was happening inside had shifted into something that required a different kind of attention than fists. "Sit down," Jolene said to Damon. She gestured toward the booth. "There is coffee, and there is a seat, and there is time. Sit down and tell me what is actually going on." Damon looked at the booth. He looked at Harold. He looked at the bruise on Harold's cheek that he had put there. Something moved through his face, fast and complicated and human. He sat down. He sat at the far edge of the bench, body angled slightly toward the door, not fleeing but keeping the option. His hands came down on the table and he looked at them instead of at anyone in the booth. The hands were large, clenched, slightly carrying a tension in them that had nothing to do with the diner and everything to do with wherever he had been before he walked through that door this morning. Jolene brought coffee. She brought it the way Connie would have brought it, without ceremony, without comment, with the specific practical kindness of a woman who understands that sometimes the most important thing you can do for a person in crisis is give them something warm to hold. She sat beside Harold. Ethan sat beside Damon not by choice, but by geometry, and the 4 of them occupied the booth in a configuration that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. The man who had been hit, the woman who had watched it happen, the son who had come to set it right, and the man who had done it. Harold looked at Damon across the table. "What is your name?" he said. Damon blinked. The question had clearly not been anticipated. He had anticipated anger or threats or the kind of cold, calculated hostility that men like the bikers outside were capable of delivering. He had not anticipated being asked his name. "Damon," he said. "Damon Ryker." "Damon," Harold said. "I am Harold. This is Jolene. That is her son, Ethan. Now we know each other." He picked up his coffee. He drank it with the measured calm of a man who has decided that whatever happens next will happen at his pace and no one else's. "Tell us what is going on," Harold said. Jolene watched Damon's face. She watched the way the muscles around his eyes contracted and released. She watched his hands on the table, the way they kept pressing flat against the surface, and then curling and then pressing flat again, the rhythm of a body trying to discharge energy it does not know how to contain. And she waited, the way she had waited for Raymond on the porch, the way she had waited for Ethan to come home, the way she had waited her entire life. But this time the waiting was not passive. This time it was a choice. She was choosing to sit here. She was choosing to hold this space open. She was choosing to be the person who does not flinch. Damon started talking. Not immediately. There was a long pause first, a pause in which he seemed to be negotiating with himself about whether to speak at all. His eyes moved from the table to the window to the table again. His jaw worked. His hands pressed flat. Then he spoke, and when he did, the voice that came out was not the voice he had used earlier that morning. It was lower, rougher at the edges, stripped of the performance that had characterized everything about him when he first walked in. "My grandfather was in Korea," Damon said. The words landed in the booth like something thrown from a great distance. Harold went very still. Jolene saw it happen, saw the particular quality of attention that moved through Harold's body the way electricity moves through wire. "He never talked about it," Damon continued. "Not once, not a single time I can remember. He died when I was 12. He stopped. The pause was not for effect. It was the pause of a person who is navigating terrain they have not spoken aloud before. And I used to think it meant it had not mattered. That the war had not mattered to him, or that he had not mattered. Harold set down his coffee cup very carefully, the ceramic making no sound against the table. "He had nightmares," Damon said. "I heard them sometimes. I slept over at his place a lot because my—" He stopped again. There was a pause that carried a whole other story inside it, a story about parents who were not available and a grandfather who was. And Jolene understood the shape of that story without needing the details, because she had served breakfast to 1,000 variations of it. "He had nightmares and he never talked about them," Damon said. "And when I asked my grandmother about it, she just said the war did something to him and that she loved him through it." And that was the end of the conversation. Jolene was listening with her whole body. She was listening the way she had learned to listen in the years with Raymond, when listening was the only form of participation she was allowed, and she heard Raymond in every word Damon said. The silence, the distance, the nightmares, the porch, the grandmother who loved him through it, the child who watched and did not understand and was never given the language to understand. He used to sit on the porch at night, Damon said, real late. I would wake up sometimes and the house would be quiet, and I would look out and he would be out there in the dark just sitting. And I never knew what he was doing. My grandmother said to leave him be. Harold's face had changed. Something had opened in it, or something had dropped away that had been held up for a long time. He was looking at Damon with the complete attention of a man who has learned what it costs to not listen. And then this morning Damon said you opened your mouth and you just spoke up. Like it was the easiest thing in the world, like you just saw something that was wrong and you said something about it. He pushed a hand through his hair. My grandfather never spoke up for himself once in his life. Not once. He just took everything quiet. I used to think that it was weakness. He paused. I know now it was not. I know that now. But when I was a kid, I thought... He could not finish the sentence. You thought he was weak? Harold said, not unkindly. Damon closed his eyes, then opened them. Yes, sir. The sir arrived like something that had been stored somewhere for a long time and finally found its address. I came in here this morning with a lot of anger, Damon said. His voice had gotten rough. I've been having a rough time and I was looking to put it somewhere and you opened your mouth and I thought you were... He stopped again. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He held them there. Then he put his hands flat on the table and looked at Jolene with red-rimmed eyes that he was controlling with everything he had. Jolene reached across the table. She put her hand on his arm. Not squeezing, not patting, just present. The way she had learned to be present with Raymond on the nights when presence was all she had to offer and all he could accept. You hit Harold because you are grieving, Jolene said quietly. She said it because Harold would have said it, but she said it first because she understood grief in a way that was different from how Harold understood it. Harold understood grief from the inside, from the soldier's perspective, from the man who carries the weight. Jolene understood it from the outside, from the wife's perspective, from the mother's perspective, from the woman who stands 3 feet away and watches the weight crush the person she loves and cannot take any of it from them, no matter how many bottles she hides or appointments she makes or doors she sits outside of at 2 in the morning. Damon's face broke. Not dramatically, not a collapse, not tears, just a fracture sudden and small and completely human at the corner of his mouth and the bridge of his nose. The specific expression of a young man who has been understood in a way he did not expect and cannot immediately defend against. He covered it fast. He pressed his hands flat on the table and looked at them hard. That is not an excuse, Damon said. His voice was unsteady. No, Harold agreed. It is not. You hit an old man in a diner and that does not get excused. But it can be understood. Those are different things. Damon did not speak. His hands pressed harder against the table. You are carrying your grandfather, Harold said. You are carrying the grief of a man who never let anyone carry it with him, and it turned into anger, because anger is easier to hold than grief. I know, I have watched that happen to men all my life. I have felt it happen to me. He glanced briefly at Jolene, a glance that Jolene caught and understood. The anger says I am strong, I am in control, I am not hurt. The grief says I love someone and I did not understand them, and now I cannot go back and try again. Jolene felt something move through her chest when Harold said those words, because they were true not just for Damon. They were true for her. They were true for the 10 years she had spent being angry at Raymond for leaving, for the 7 years she had spent being angry at Ethan, for blaming her for the 20 years she had spent being angry at herself, for standing at the edge of things instead of walking into the middle of them. I never understood him, Damon said, barely loud enough to carry across the table, not until it was too late. Ethan made a sound, low, almost involuntary. The sound a person makes when something hits them in the center of themselves. Jolene heard it. She did not look at Ethan because Ethan did not need to be looked at right now. He needed to hear what he was hearing. It is not too late to understand him, Harold said to Damon. The understanding can still happen. It just happens without him in the room. You look at the shape of his life and you look at what he came home carrying and you decide to see it for what it was rather than what you needed it to be when you were 12. That is harder. It takes longer, but it is not too late. Damon pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes again. He held them there for a moment. Then he put his hands flat on the table and looked at Harold with red-rimmed eyes and said, I am sorry I hit you. Harold looked at him. I know that does not fix it, Damon said. I accept it, Harold said. Not because it erases what happened, because you meant it. And because I think your grandfather would have appreciated you saying it even if he is not here to receive it. He paused. Men like him, men like me, we did not know how to ask for things like that. We should have. You knowing how to offer it matters. The diner was utterly quiet. Then Hank at the counter picked up his coffee cup and drank, and the sound of it was enough to let the room breathe again. Jolene looked at Damon. She looked at this young man sitting across from her in her mother's diner, and she did not see the man who had walked in that morning with his swagger and his anger and his leather jacket. She saw someone else. She saw the boy who had slept at his grandfather's house because his parents were not available. She saw the 12-year-old who had lost the only stable presence in his life. She saw Raymond at 28. She saw Ethan at 21. She saw the same grief wearing different faces in different decades, and she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she was looking at a pattern that would keep repeating until someone broke it. "What is your full name?" Harold said to Damon. His voice had changed. There was something in it that had not been there before. A tension, a question forming behind the words. Damon looked at him. "Damon Ryker." "Your grandfather's name," Harold said. Something shifted in Damon's face. Surprise maybe at the question. "Eugene," he said. "Eugene Ryker. He was a corporal." Harold went completely still. Jolene saw it happen. She saw the stillness move through his body the way a current moves through water, changing everything without breaking the surface. His hands, which had been wrapped loosely around his coffee cup, tightened. His eyes, which had been steady and measured, went to a place she had never seen them go. A place that was 70 years away and 30 degrees below zero and darker than the inside of the earth. The name Eugene Ryker had done something to Harold Prescott that nothing else this morning had managed to do. Not the slap, not the bruise, not the cracked glasses or the cold coffee or the pain. The name had reached into the specific part of him where Korea lived, and had found something there that had been waiting 70 years to be found. "Your grandfather," Harold said, and his voice came out barely above a whisper. "Your grandfather saved my life." The words landed in the booth like something dropped from a great height. Damon's face went the color of something from which all the blood has retreated. Jolene's hand found Harold's arm. She held it. Ethan had gone very still beside Damon. He was looking at his father with the expression of a man who has just realized that the person sitting across from him contains rooms he has never been allowed to enter. Harold told the story. He told it slowly. He told it in the way a man tells a thing he has carried for 70 years and has never spoken aloud in its complete form. Not to Margaret, not to the therapist at the VA that he saw exactly twice in 1954 before deciding that talking about Korea to a man who had never been to Korea was a form of translation that lost too much in the process. Not to anyone. Chosin Reservoir, November 30th, 1950. The western side. The temperature had dropped to 30 below zero, and the wind coming off the reservoir turned the cold into something that was not merely uncomfortable but actively hostile, a force that attacked the body with the systematic efficiency of an enemy that never needed to rest and never ran out of ammunition. Their position had been hit in the dark. Chinese forces moving in waves coming out of the terrain with a coordination that the American forces had not anticipated and could not match. The noise had been absolute. The kind of noise that does not leave space for thought, that fills the skull and the chest and the hands, and leaves you operating on something that is not quite instinct and not quite training, but is the specific animal intelligence of a body that has decided to survive and is no longer consulting the mind about how. Harold had been moving across a ridge when the ground gave way beneath him. Not from shelling. From the simple failure of frozen earth to support a man's weight in conditions it was not designed to support it. He had gone down into a creek bed, the impact slamming the air out of his lungs, and the water, what was left of it beneath the ice, had soaked through his boots and his trousers, and the cold had arrived with a totality that was almost peaceful. That was the thing about extreme cold that no one told you. At a certain point, it stopped feeling like pain and started feeling like an invitation. Lie down. Be still. Let the cold do the work. The body's own mechanisms of survival began to whisper suggestions that were indistinguishable from surrender. Sleep. Rest. You have done enough. He had lain in that creek bed, and he had thought with a clarity that he would remember for the rest of his life, "This is where I die." Not with drama, not with any particular emotion, just the flat, factual recognition of a situation that had exceeded his capacity to change it. And then Eugene Ryker had appeared at the edge of the creek bed. He had not been ordered there. He had not been assigned to Harold. He had simply been moving through the same dark, through the same cold, through the same chaos, and he had looked down into that frozen creek and he had seen Harold, and he had made a decision. The decision had not been rational. A rational man would have assessed the situation and concluded that descending into a creek bed under fire and 30 below temperatures to drag out a soldier who might already be beyond saving was not a sound tactical choice. A rational man would have moved on. Eugene Ryker had not been a rational man. He had been something better. He had been a stubborn man. He had come down into the creek bed, and he had grabbed Harold under the arms and he had pulled. Harold weighed 170 pounds and was wearing 60 pounds of gear and was half frozen and unable to help. And Eugene Ryker had pulled him out of that creek bed and across 60 yards of frozen ground with Chinese forces close enough that Harold could hear them speaking to each other in the dark. 60 yards, in 30 below, under fire, with nothing but his own body and his own stubbornness and a refusal to leave a man behind that had not consulted logic or self-preservation or any of the reasonable arguments that might have justified walking away. He had dragged Harold back to their line. He had wrapped Harold in his own jacket. He had stayed with him until the medics came, and he had not said a single word about it afterward. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. Harold told this to Damon and to Jolene and to Ethan and to the diner and to the 70 years of silence that had contained it. He told it in a voice that was steady at the beginning and rough by the middle and barely above a whisper by the end. And when he finished, the silence in Connie's diner was the deepest silence Jolene had ever heard. It was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something too large for sound. It was the silence that exists at the center of things that matter too much for words. Damon was staring at Harold. His mouth was slightly open and his hands were pressed flat on the table, and his body was rigid with the effort of processing what he had just been told. That his grandfather, the quiet man on the porch, the man with the nightmares and the silence and the baseball and the 1,000-yard stare, had crawled into a frozen creek bed in the dark in 30 below and dragged a man to safety and never told anyone he did it. He never told us, Damon said. It was barely sound. No, Harold said. He would not have. The weight of that statement settled over the table like weather. Jolene understood it. She understood it because Raymond had never told her about Fallujah either. She had learned the general facts from other wives, from news reports, from the scattered fragments that escape even the most determined silence. But the specific things, the particular moments, the things that lived in the nightmares and on the porch at 3 a.m, those Raymond had never given her. He had carried them alone, believing he was protecting her, believing that silence was a form of love. Jolene looked at Damon and she saw in his face the same thing she had felt for 10 years. The specific grief of a person who has loved someone they did not fully know and who now, too late, is beginning to understand what they did not know and why they did not know it. "Tell me about him," Damon said. "Please, whatever you remember, tell me about my grandfather." Harold looked at this young man who had walked into the diner that morning like a storm and was sitting across from him now, like a person, just a person undefended and asking for something he had needed for a very long time. He thought about what he remembered of Eugene Ryker. Not the action on the reservoir, not the moment of rescue, though he would carry that privately for the rest of his life. He thought about the smaller things. The things that constitute a man's daily presence in the world when the world was a frozen ridgeline in Korea and the daily presence was all you had. Your grandfather Harold said argued that the Brooklyn Dodgers were the finest thing God had made since the Grand Canyon, and he would make that case at any hour of the day or night to anyone willing or unwilling to listen. Damon made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, small and sudden and raw at the edges. He talked about baseball constantly, Harold continued. It was his way of staying connected to home. When things got bad, when the cold reached a level that your body stops being able to fully process, he would start talking about baseball. Specific games, specific plays, details you would have to be paying very close attention to remember. Harold shook his head slightly. I do not think he even knew he was doing it. It was just where his mind went when it needed somewhere safe to be. Damon was staring at him. He used to do that at the dinner table, Damon said, his voice catching. My grandmother used to roll her eyes. He would just launch into it. A game from 1947. A pitch from some player none of us had ever heard of. Roy Campanella, Harold said. He talked about Roy Campanella like the man was a personal friend. Damon's face did something complicated and beautiful. The specific expression that belongs to a person encountering a piece of someone they loved that they had never known existed. Like finding a room in a house you thought you knew completely. Yes, Damon said. Campanella. He had a photograph of him. He did, Harold confirmed. He kept it in his left breast pocket. He said it was good luck. He paused. Whether it was or was not, he came home. So perhaps he was right. And Harold continued. He talked about Eugene Ryker for 20 minutes. He talked about the way Eugene had taught 3 men in their unit to play poker using a deck with 2 missing cards, and how he had made rules for the missing cards that changed depending on what he needed them to be, and how nobody had called him on it because the game was never really about the cards. He talked about the way Eugene had written letters, long careful letters, in a small precise handwriting that seemed inconsistent with the large rough hands doing the writing, and how he had been intensely private about them, tucking them into his jacket, immediately never reading them aloud, never even mentioning who they were for. He talked about Eugene's stubbornness, which was legendary within the unit, and had saved at least 2 lives that Harold knew of through sheer refusal to accept outcomes that did not suit him. He talked about Eugene laughing, which was a sound like rocks tumbling down a hillside, ungraceful and unstoppable and somehow exactly right. Damon listened to every word. He did not interrupt, he did not look away. He was receiving these pieces of his grandfather the way a person receives something precious that they have been told is lost and has turned out not to be. Jolene listened too. She listened and she thought about Raymond. About the Raymond she had never known, the Raymond who had existed before Iraq, the Raymond who had laughed and danced and thrown Ethan into the air. She thought about the pieces of Raymond that had been lost to the war, and that nobody would ever sit in a booth and hand back to Ethan because the men who had served with Raymond were either gone or unreachable or carrying their own silences. And she thought about Connie. About her mother who had stood behind this counter for 37 years and listened to 1,000 stories from 1,000 people who needed somewhere to tell them. The diner had always been that, not just a place where you ate, a place where you could sit down and be heard. Connie had known that. She had built it that way, not with the architecture, but with the atmosphere, with the coffee and the smile and the way she remembered your name and your order and the thing you mentioned last Tuesday about your daughter's school play. Jolene understood now, sitting in her mother's booth with her mother's customers and her mother's coffee maker humming behind her, that this was what Connie had been trying to tell her in those last days. You hold too much. Stop serving everyone else and let someone serve you. The diner was not meant to be a place where Jolene martyred herself. It was meant to be a place where broken people sat down together and the breaking became something else. Ethan was quiet through all of Harold's telling. But at some point, Jolene noticed without commenting on it, Ethan had taken out his phone and placed it on the table with the record function running, giving Damon something to take home, giving Eugene Ryker's memory a longer reach than the morning. When Harold finished, the four of them sat in a silence that had changed completely in its quality from every other silence that had occurred at that table that morning. This one was full rather than empty, heavy in the good way. The way things are heavy when they have meaning. "Thank you," Damon said. His voice was rough but steady. "I grew up thinking he was one thing and he was that thing, but he was also this whole other thing I did not know anything about. And now I have something." He gestured vaguely at the space between them that was full of Eugene Ryker. "I have something now." "You had it before," Harold said. "You just did not know it." Damon looked at him. "You should be angrier at me," he said. "I hit you. I called you terrible things. You should not be sitting here telling me stories about my grandfather." "Probably not," Harold agreed. "And yet here we are." A beat. Then Damon said, "Why?" Jolene answered before Harold could. "Because your grandfather dragged Harold out of a frozen creek," she said. "And because Harold has been sitting in this booth for 11 years carrying that alone. And because the least any of us can do for the people who saved us is to tell the truth about them when their grandchildren show up looking lost." She said it and she heard her mother's voice in her own voice, and she felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for a very long time. She was not just serving coffee. She was not just keeping the diner open. She was doing the thing Connie had built this place to do. "I am sorry, Mr. Prescott," Damon said. "For all of it." Harold reached across the table and shook his hand. Firm. The way men shake hands when they mean it. "I accept your apology," Harold said. "Not because it erases what happened. Because you meant it. And because I think Eugene would have wanted me to." Damon stood. He reached into his pocket and put $30 on the table. "For the coffee," he said. "And for the check I did not pay right the first time." He said it evenly without theater. He walked to the door. His hand touched the handle. He stopped. He turned back. "Is there somewhere I can go to learn more about what he went through?" Damon said. "About the Chosin, about all of it." His voice was careful, measured, carrying the specific vulnerability of asking for something you are not sure you will be given. "I want to understand it. I want to understand what he went through and where he was, and what it was like. I feel like I owe him that." Jolene looked at this young man in the doorway of her mother's diner, and she felt something move through her that she had not felt in a very long time. Not grief, not the weight that she associated with the men who had gone to war and come back different. Something that had to do with continuation. With the idea that the things a man lived and suffered and survived might travel forward in time past the point where the man himself could carry them passed on by the people who came after if those people were given the chance to receive them. "There's a Veterans Museum in Macon," Harold said. "Korean War exhibit 3rd floor. I helped them with it some years back." He paused. "And if you want to know more than the museum can tell you, you come back here. Thursday mornings, I am in this booth at 7. "Thursday," Damon said. Thursday, Jolene confirmed before Harold could. And she said it with the authority of a woman who has decided that Thursday belongs to her diner and she will decide who sits in it. Damon Ryker walked out of Connie's diner a different man than the one who had walked in. The door settled closed behind him. The bell above it jingled twice the way it always did. Through the window, Jolene watched him get into his car. He sat there for a moment before starting the engine the way Raymond used to sit in his truck. The way Harold sat in his booth, the way men sit when they are between the place they have been and the place they are going and need a moment in the space between. Then he drove away. Jolene turned back to the booth. Harold and Ethan were looking at each other across the table with the particular expression of two men who have just witnessed a woman do something neither of them fully anticipated. Ethan spoke first. "That was something, Mom." Jolene picked up the empty coffee cups. "It was a Tuesday," she said. "Tuesdays are always something." She carried the cups to the counter and set them in the sink and stood there for a moment with her back to the booth, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, breathing. Just breathing. The way Harold breathed when he first sat down each morning. The way you breathe when breathing is the only peaceful act left to you and you are going to do it properly. She came back to the booth. She sat down. Not at the edge this time. She slid in next to Harold, and she sat there in the middle of things, in the center of her own life, in a place she had not occupied in a very long time. "There is something I need to tell you," she said to Ethan. Ethan looked at her. His face was open in a way she had not seen it be open since he was a teenager, before Raymond got bad, before the kitchen and the accusation and the 7 years. "Your father," Jolene said. 2 weeks before he died. He came here." Ethan went still. "He came to the diner," Jolene said. He sat at the counter. It was early before opening. I was setting up, and he came in, and he sat down, and he looked at me, and he said something that I have been carrying for 10 years. Harold was watching her. His bruised cheek, his steady eyes, the weight of his own unspoken things lending gravity to hers. He said, Jolene continued, and her voice was very controlled now, held together with the specific discipline of a woman who has practiced holding herself together for 20 years. He said to tell Jolene, I know she tried. Tell her I could see it. Every time she hid the bottles. Every time she sat outside the bathroom door. Every time she made the appointment I did not keep. I saw all of it. And it was not her fault. Tell her it was never her fault. She stopped. She breathed. She continued. He did not say it to me directly. He walked in and he sat at the counter and he said those words to the room. Like a confession. Like a prayer. Like a man who needed the words to exist somewhere outside of himself but could not look at the person they were meant for while he said them. He looked at the counter the whole time. He said the words and then he got up and he walked out, and 2 weeks later he was gone. The diner held those words the way the diner held everything. Quietly. Without judgment. In the walls and the counter and the cracked vinyl and the bell above the door, Ethan was pressing the back of his hand against his eyes. He was pressing hard the way people press against things when they need to feel pressure to counterbalance the pressure building inside them. He knew, Ethan said. His voice was barely there. He knew what she was doing and he still could not stop. Yes, Jolene said. And the knowing was part of the weight. Knowing someone loves you enough to fight for you and not being able to let them win. That is a particular kind of suffering that I would not wish on anyone. Ethan's hand came away from his eyes. They were wet. He did not apologize for it. He looked at his mother with the direct, unguarded expression of a man who has been carrying the wrong story for 7 years and has just been handed the right one. Why did you not tell me, he said. Because I did not know how to give it to you while you were blaming me, Jolene said. And because some part of me was afraid that if I told you your father saw what I was doing and still could not stop, it would make his death worse instead of better. I was trying to protect you from the full weight of it. She paused. Which is probably the same reason Eugene Ryker never told Damon about the reservoir, and the same reason Harold never told his wife Margaret about Korea. We do a lot of damage, believing we are protecting the people we love from difficult things when mostly we are protecting ourselves from the difficulty of saying them. She looked at Harold when she said it. Harold looked back at her. And in his eyes she saw something she had not seen there before. Recognition. The recognition of a man who has just heard his own life described by someone who understood it from a vantage point he had never considered. Jolene turned back to Ethan. She reached across the table. She took his hand. Your father loved you, she said. He loved you, and he loved me, and he loved Bridget, and he carried all of that love into a war, and the war broke the part of him that knew how to show it. But the love was there. It was always there. It just could not get out. Ethan held his mother's hand. He held it the way you hold something real. Outside the diner windows, the November morning was moving forward at its own unhurried pace. The parking lot, the road, the sky over Georgia clear and cold and indifferent to the things happening beneath it. The world doing what the world always does, continuing regardless of whether the people in it are ready for what comes next. And then Jolene's phone rang. She looked at the screen. The number was one she recognized. An area code she saw on Sunday mornings when Bridget remembered to call. But this was not Sunday. And the urgency in the way the phone vibrated in her hand told her before she answered that this was not a routine call. Hello, baby, she said, and her voice did something on the word baby that she could not control. It went soft in the specific way that a mother's voice goes soft when the child on the other end is the child who did not leave loudly, who did not slam the door but simply stopped opening it. The child who drifted away so gradually that by the time Jolene noticed the distance it had become too large to cross with a single conversation. Mom, Bridget said. And Jolene could hear it in her daughter's voice. The thin, urgent quality of a young woman who has been holding something together across a distance and has reached the end of what the distance can hold. Where are you? Jolene said. I am in the parking lot, Bridget said. Jolene stood up from the booth. She was moving before she understood she was moving the way a body moves, when it hears something it has been waiting to hear and the waiting itself becomes propulsion. Ethan was moving too, reading his mother's face, following her without being told to follow. They went through the diner door together, mother and son, the bell jingling behind them, and Jolene stepped into the parking lot, and the Georgia morning hit her face with this cold November air, and she saw Bridget. 25 years old. Dark hair like Jolene's like Connie's. Standing beside a rental car with the airport sticker still on the bumper, wearing the expression of a woman who has been holding herself together across a 4-hour flight and a 2-hour drive and has run out of whatever structural material she was using. Mom, Bridget said. And then she saw Ethan behind Jolene, and her hand came up to her mouth, and the sound she made was not a word, but was a whole language. Ethan, she said through her fingers. Oh my God, Ethan. Ethan crossed the distance. Bridget went into his arms with the particular urgency of a sister who has not seen her brother in 7 years and has spent every one of those years missing him in the specific way that younger siblings miss older ones, with a combination of anger and longing and the unfulfilled expectation that the older one was supposed to stay. They held each other. Ethan's jaw tightened above her head. His eyes closed for 1 second, just one, and then opened again. Bridget made the kind of sounds that have no language. Jolene watched her children hold each other, and she felt something happen in her chest that she would not attempt to name. Some things do not need names. Some things just need to be allowed to be exactly what they are. After a long moment, Bridget pulled back. She looked at Ethan's face, studied it the way you study a person's face when you are inventorying them, making sure they are real, making sure they are whole. 7 years, she said. I know, Ethan said. I called you, she said. And there was something in her voice now that was not only relief, something with an edge to it, something that had been waiting its turn behind the emotion. I called you so many times, Ethan. After Mom lost the diner number, after Grandma Connie. I called and I left messages. I know, Ethan said again, quiet, not defensive. You did not call back, Bridget said. Not once. Ethan looked at his sister. He did not offer excuses. He did not try to explain. He simply held her gaze and let the accusation land where it landed. I am not doing that right now, Bridget said. She pressed her lips together. I am telling you that it hurt. I am telling you it hurt a lot. And then I am setting it down because this is not the day for it. She looked at him steadily. But do not think I forgot. I do not think you forgot, Ethan said. And I am not going to ask you to forgive it right now. You can take as long as you need. Bridget looked at him for another moment. Then she turned to Jolene and the edge dropped out of her entirely. She took her mother's face in both hands. Both hands the way Connie used to, the gesture so specifically Connie's that the sight of it on Bridget's hands landed on Jolene like something physical. What happened to your face? Bridget said. She was reading the morning in her mother's eyes, the strain and the tears and all of it. It is a long story, Jolene said. How did you know to come? Harold called me, Bridget said. Jolene stared at her. He has my number. Grandma Connie gave it to him before she died. He called me this morning after the trouble at the diner and told me I needed to come home. Jolene looked through the diner window at Harold sitting in his booth. That man, she said softly. That man has been doing more for this family from a corner booth than any of us have done from up close. And there is something else, Bridget said. She reached into her bag. She pulled out 3 envelopes. Cream-colored. The stationery Connie had kept in the second drawer of her writing desk for as long as any of them could remember. The good stationery. The stationery she used for things that mattered. Each envelope had a name on it in Connie's handwriting. That small, careful, beautiful script she had used for everything important. Jolene, Ethan, Bridget. Bridget's was already open. Grandma gave them to me, Bridget said. The week before she died. She said she had written 3 letters and she needed me to hold them until the right time. She said I would know when. Jolene looked at the envelopes. 3 years. Her mother had written these letters 3 years ago in the final days when the cancer had taken everything except the clarity of her mind and the steadiness of her hand and the absolute certainty with which Connie Whitfield had always known what her family needed, even when her family did not know it themselves. 3 years, Ethan said. He was looking at the envelope with his name on it. I know, Bridget said. I tried to give them out before. But you were not talking to Mom. And Mom was so closed off after Grandma died that every time I thought about giving you yours, I would look at your face and I could not do it. She looked at Jolene. I was waiting for you to be ready. Jolene held her envelope. She held it in both hands. Connie's handwriting. After 3 years. After 10 years of carrying Raymond. After 7 years of losing Ethan. After 20 years behind this counter. She knew, Jolene said very quietly. She knew there would be a right time. She said it like a fact, Bridget said. Not like she hoped. Like she knew. She said the time will come when Jolene stops holding everything alone and the children come back and you are all in the same place. Give them the letters then. Come inside, Jolene said. Both of you, come inside. They went in together. All 3 of them. The bell jingled. They settled into the booth, the corner booth with the duct tape vinyl, and Harold made room and Jolene sat beside him and Ethan and Bridget sat across. At the counter, Hank and the 5 bikers sat quietly, not intruding, not leaving, simply present the way men are present. When they understand they are part of something larger than their individual role in it. They did not speak into the family's conversation. They just sat nearby, close enough to be part of the room, far enough to give the booth its privacy. Jolene opened her envelope. Her hands were not steady. She did not pretend they were. She worked the envelope open with the careful, deliberate attention of a woman handling something she could not afford to damage, and she unfolded 2 pages of cream paper covered in her mother's handwriting, and she read. Connie had written to her daughter the way Connie had done everything. Directly. Without ornamentation. With the specific practical wisdom of a woman who had run a diner for 37 years and had learned that the most important things are the things you say plainly. Jolene read for 3 minutes. Her face moved through things during those 3 minutes that Ethan and Bridget had not seen it move through before. She did not look away from the pages. Her hands held them carefully, steadily, despite the trembling. When she finished, she folded the pages. She placed them back in the envelope. She held the envelope in both hands, and she looked at the table for a long moment. Then she looked up. She said Jolene started, and her voice was a thing. In progress being built as she spoke, constructed word by word from materials that had been stored for a very long time. She said that I have been holding this diner together the way I hold everything together. With my hands and my silence and my refusal to sit down. She said the diner does not need me to hold it. It needs me to live in it. She said stop serving everyone else and let someone serve you for once in your stubborn life. Jolene's voice broke on the word stubborn. She pressed her hand to her mouth. She held it there. Then she lowered it. She said that Raymond's death was not my fault, and that Ethan leaving was not my fault, and that being tired is not the same as being weak, and that the strongest thing I can do now is stop being strong long enough to let my children see that I need them. Bridget was crying silently. Ethan's jaw was set in the way that meant he was holding everything in with both hands. Read yours, Jolene said to Ethan. Ethan opened his envelope. He read it. He read it once, and then he pressed both palms flat against the letter on the table, and he looked at the ceiling and he breathed. 4 slow counts in, 4 slow counts out. She said Ethan began, and his voice was a thread. She said your mother tried to save your father every single day for 7 years. She said she watched your mother sit outside bathroom doors and hide bottles and make phone calls and beg. She said your mother fought a war that nobody gave her a uniform for, and she fought it alone, and she fought it with love. And when she lost, she did not stop loving. She did not stop showing up. He stopped. He looked at Jolene. She said to forgive you, Mom. She said you were doing the best you could with a situation that would have broken anyone. She said any man who blames his mother for not saving his father from a war does not understand what war does to the people who love the soldiers. Jolene reached across the table. She took her son's hand. He held it. He held it the way you hold something real. Bridget opened her letter. She read it. She smiled through her tears. She said to come home more, Bridget said. She said the diner needs me, but my mother needs me more. She said to bring pie. She paused and a laugh came through the tears. She said I make the best pie in the family, and she was not above bribery from beyond the grave. Something broke open in the booth. Not grief, not relief. Something that was both and neither and larger than either. A sound that might have been laughter came from Jolene, or might have been crying, or might have been the specific sound a person makes when they have been holding everything together for 20 years and the holding finally becomes unnecessary. Harold sat beside her. He had been quiet through the letters. He had been present the way he was always present, the way Jolene had been learning. All morning was not passivity, but a different kind of strength. The strength of a man who understands that sometimes the most important thing you can do in a room is simply be in it. Jolene put her hand on his arm. Thank you, she said, for calling Bridget, for sitting in this booth every morning for 11 years and being the one constant thing in this diner that I could count on, for speaking up this morning when I could not. Harold looked at her. Your mother would be proud of you, he said. Not for the diner, for today, for the phone call, for sitting down with that young man, for telling your son the truth. Jolene held his gaze. And you, Mr. Prescott, she said. You are going to stop sitting in this booth alone. Thursdays at minimum. My son will be here. That young man will be here. My daughter will be here when she can. And you will be here. Because you are family, and family sits together. Harold looked at her for a long moment. He was 81 years old. He had not been called family by anyone since Margaret died. The word landed on him with a weight that was not heavy, but was significant. The way certain words are significant when they arrive after a long absence, and fill a space that had been empty so long you had forgotten it was a space at all. Thursday, he said. Thursday, Jolene confirmed. And Sunday, and Thanksgiving, and Christmas, and every morning in between that you walk through that door there will be coffee, and there will be a seat, and there will be people in this booth who are glad you are in it. Ethan reached across the table and put his hand over Harold's. Harold looked at the hand. He looked at Ethan. He turned his hand over and held it. The way you hold something you have decided not to let go of. Bridget reached across and took her mother's hand. Jolene held her daughter's hand and held Harold's arm, and the four of them sat in the booth with the duct-tape vinyl seat and Connie's letters between them and the morning turning into afternoon, and the diner filling with the sounds that Jolene had arranged her life around for 20 years, but had never until this moment fully inhabited. From the counter, Hank picked up his coffee cup and raised it slightly in their direction. Not a toast, just an acknowledgement. The quiet gesture of a man who has watched something happen that deserved to be witnessed. Ethan raised his cup back. Jolene raised hers. And somewhere in the walls of Connie's diner, in the warmth and the smell of coffee, and the ordinary sounds of a morning going about its business, something that had been broken for a very long time made a sound like the first quiet movement toward being whole. Jolene thought about Connie. About the letter. About stop serving everyone else and let someone serve you. She thought about Raymond in the driveway sitting in his truck looking at the house. She thought about what Harold had said earlier. The distance is not physical, it is the distance between who you were before and who you came back as. She thought about the fact that she had crossed that distance this morning. Not by walking, by speaking, by picking up a phone, by sitting down in the middle of her own life instead of standing at the edge of it. She thought about Thursday, about Damon coming back to learn about his grandfather, about Ethan sitting in this booth, about Bridget flying home, about Harold who had been saving her a seat for 11 years without either of them knowing that was what he was doing. She thought about all these broken things finding their way to the same table, and about the fact that her mother had known from a hospital bed 3 years ago that this morning would come. Known that the broken things would not stay broken. Known that her stubborn, loving, tired, counter-standing daughter would one day sit down. And when she sat down, the people who loved her would find their way to the booth. She thought about Eugene Ryker, who had crawled into a frozen creek bed in 1950 and dragged a stranger to safety and never told a soul. She thought about the way a single act of courage can travel forward through time, through 70 years, through a grandson's grief, through a diner on Route 9, through 3 letters on cream stationery, and still be arriving, still making itself known, still changing the shape of a morning. She thought about Raymond. She thought about the words he had spoken to the empty diner 2 weeks before he died. Tell Jolene I know she tried. She thought about how those words had lived in this room for 10 years. Held in the walls and the counter and the coffee maker, waiting for the morning when Jolene would be ready to hear them not as an accusation of her failure, but as an acknowledgement of her fight. She thought about Ethan, who had driven past the diner in the early mornings before opening just to see if the lights were on. She thought about the particular kind of love that expresses itself as surveillance, as keeping watch from a distance, as making sure the lights are on without being willing to walk through the door. She understood that love now. It was the same love that had made her keep his phone number under the register for 8 months without calling. The same love that had made Raymond sit on the porch at 3 in the morning instead of coming to bed. The same love that had made Harold sit in this booth for 11 years without ever telling Jolene that she mattered to him. Love that wears the wrong coat. Jolene Whitfield, 53 years old. Daughter of Connie, widow of Raymond, mother of Ethan and Bridget, the woman who kept the diner open, the woman who held everything and asked for nothing and stood behind the counter and went on. She picked up her coffee cup. It was warm in her hands. She drank it the way you drink something when the drinking is not about the coffee, but about the act of sitting still in a warm place with people you love and letting the morning be exactly what it is. Some mornings break you open, and what pours in if you are still, if you are patient, if you have survived long enough to receive it, is everything you thought you had lost coming home at last. The bell above the door jingled. A regular customer walked in. Jolene looked up from the booth. She did not get up. She did not rush behind the counter. Gladys, her cook, was there. The coffee was fresh. The diner was running. Jolene stayed in her seat. She stayed with her children and with Harold and with the letters and with the morning. She stayed because her mother had told her to sit down, and for the first time in 20 years, Jolene Whitfield listened. "Welcome to Connie's," Gladys called from behind the counter. "Sit anywhere you like." And the morning went on.